Hey, I'm Duke on Twitch. If you want to support the channel and GreenSunsZenith.com, you can find my Patreon, merch store, and singles store, where you can buy singles through TCG Player or Card Hoarder in the video description. If you want to get in contact, you can also find all that info in the description below for things like donation deck lists or just wanting to reach out. Alright, let's get right into it. Hey team, welcome back to Dukes on Twitch. Back today with something a little bit different. This is going to be a card breakdown of Orcish Bowmasters from a Maverick's perspective. So looking at the deck or the card in Maverick, in Legacy, what I believe it's going to do, where it fits, and hopefully gives you a good idea of where to target the card going forward. So first up, obviously Orcish Bowmasters was printed in the recent Lord of the Rings set, and it's a pretty fantastic card, let's be honest. For 2 mana, 1 and a black, you may cast this at instant speed due to flash, and when Orcish Bowmasters enters the battlefield, and whenever an opponent draws a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmasters deals 1 damage to any target, then amass 1 orc. So one quick thing is a lot of people don't read this and figure that it actually triggers on ETB. So drawing cards aside, this card comes down and amasses 1, which is pretty great. You get 2 power for 2, you get a pretty nice effect, and you get it in a pretty splashable color. You're playing 1 in a black instead of double black, or say black blue. So I think Orcish Bowmasters has got a lot of hype recently, and that's because it is seen as a pretty splashable card. There's a lot of decks in Legacy that either play black, have splashed black, or could easily splash for the color. So I think the big question right now for a lot of people in my situation is it going to be better in or against Maverick? So let's break it down. What does it do? What does it do for Legacy? What does it do for Maverick? And where to from here? Where do we kind of see the metagame shifting towards with a card like Orcish Bowmasters in the format? So first up, I would break it down into 2 different parts. One is the disruption element and one is the pressure element. So obviously the disruption is the ability to ping, and the pressure is going wide instead of tall with orcs, which is pretty cool. One quick thing I want you to do is think of 4 cards that have defined Legacy since its beginning. I'll give you a few seconds, because obviously it's been around for a long time. Now I'm going to assume that probably at least 3 of your cards are these: Brainstorm, Wasteland, Daze, and Force. Now, with this printing, obviously a lot of talk has been around one of them, and that kind of fits into the next section, which is when you think of draws a card except for the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, what cards do you think about when this can apply? What cards come to mind when you think of cards in Legacy that draw? Probably the straight up, the Cantrip Cartel. Obviously Preordain hasn't seen as much play as recently outside of combo decks, but you're probably thinking of these, which is correct. A lot of decks play these cards because they are just so powerful, and they do of course draw you cards, which Orc is going to have some additional hate against, which is pretty cool. But here's some other cards in Legacy that are A, wildly played, B, are kind of the basis for a lot of strategies within Legacy, and C, is just a massive part of Legacy, is drawing cards. It's kind of one of the, not broken elements of the format, but it is part of the format that makes it a little bit different to the others. You obviously have things from Grizzlebrand to Echo to Elvish Visionary to Minsk and Boo to Esper Sentinel. A lot of different ways to draw, either at sorcery or instant speed, attached to a permanent or not. It's something that's going to come up against a range of decks. So although you might just think of blue decks when you think of draw, there's actually a lot of decks in the format, no matter the colors, that draw cards. So I wouldn't say Orc is as cornered. What's the word? It's coming to me. It's not as niche as you might think on first appearance. So when does Maverick have additional draws? Well, Maverick is obviously a creature-based deck, which doesn't have too many ways to draw additional cards, and some of those in 2023 aren't even played. So Sylvan Library is probably the biggest one that comes to mind. Canopy lands, of course, as well as a card that Knight of the Reliquary can go and fetch. And then we do have some creatures like Palace Jail or Tiles Tracker that see play from time to time that also allow for additional card draw. Minsc & Boo has probably been the biggest one recently, which, of course, with the sack allows you to draw cards, and is something your opponent can respond to. So, obviously, if you're sacking a big creature, or if you are, sacking a smaller creature like a smaller Mince just to draw some cards, Orc can do a lot of damage. So, although it isn't something that's going to come up a lot, the ETB is going to come up a lot more than the actual draw effects. Some of these you can do at instant speed, which is great, but ones like Sylvan Library or the Monarch or Minsc & Boo are more at sorcery speed, and an Orc is either going to get you with Flash or put you in a position where you are going to have to maybe lose one or two creatures or take one or two damage before you can deal with it. So what's Maverick's previous draw hate? Have we actually been interested in stopping opponents from drawing cards? And the answer is yes. From way back when the deck used to play Chains of Mephistopheles, a card that used to see a lot of play in decks like Punishing Jund. I believe Maverick picked it up from time to time in the sideboard as just a nice way to deal with blue decks and deal with cantrips in decks that at the time didn't have cards like Prismatic Ending, so it was a lot harder to deal with Chains. Obviously in Conspiracy, we also got a card like Leovold Emissary of Trest, which I think a lot of players wished was black, green, and white instead of blue. That would have been pretty sweet, but the blue part of Leovold was always kind of the reason why it didn't see as much play in Maverick. It was just that color that a lot of the deck hates on, and the splash for blue just isn't as strong as other splashes. Spirit of the Labyrinth in Border of the Gods was another one of those cards that got a lot of hype, and it really comes back to Brainstorm. A lot of people associating being able to turn off cards like Brainstorm as being game winning and having that sort of broken effect on the format, which obviously isn't as true as some people like to think. But I even remember when I saw Spirit of the Labyrinth, I was like, wow, that's pretty great. Especially at the time playing Death and Taxes in a deck with Aether Vial. Hey, instant speed Spirit of the Labyrinth. That is pretty cool. Well, I guess now with Orc, with Flash, no need for Aether Vial to be punishing cards like Brainstorm. I put a question mark on Hull Breacher. I do think Hull Breacher one day might suit some sort of Bant Maverick deck, but for now, it has seen some testing from some players within the Maverick community, but I wouldn't say it's a kind of staple card that Maverick's tried as a draw hate piece. So, the deal 1 damage to any target. If anyone, and I apologize to bring this up, but obviously there was a metagame with Ren, and it probably had some pretty, it probably caused some pretty tough board states for opponents, or at least for players of the Maverick type, because there are a lot of cards that Ren hit. And as you can see, a lot of it is mana, a lot of it is tax, and some of it is protection. So yes, Orcish Bowmasters is going to be pretty good against Maverick, because it's going to be hitting a lot of cards we just naturally have on the board to build out our game plan. If we're wanting to accelerate on mana, if we're wanting to tax our opponent with either Spirit or Thalia, if we, play a Minsc and get a Boo and then try to tick up on the Boo, they can play an Orcish and ping the Boo. That's pretty brutal, especially for 2 mana, and especially for many decks in the format that are going to be able to just, play a land and pass and hold up a plethora of spells at instant speed, including Orcish Bowmasters. That's going to be hard to navigate going forward, because a lot of these cards can't really be saved unless you get something like a Mother of Runes Online, but then there's a whole nother kind of story to talk about. But for other decks, there's still a lot of X1s in the format. Some of those, of course, are a little bit harder to hit. Sometimes Nomads in Core or DRC or Delver will be bigger than an X1, or have a creature to move damage away from. But it's, again, a little bit like the slide before with all of the different draw effects in Legacy, there's also a lot of X1 creatures in Legacy. A lot of different decks utilize them, a lot of different decks rely on them, and again, Orcish is not going to be narrowed into this corner. It's going to be a card that against a lot of matchups is going to be relevant, and I think that's a pretty clear kind of evidence that this is kind of a fire design card. The reason that I actually put the Esper Sentinel, the Baleful Strix, the Ice Fang, the Elvish Visionary, and the Fairy at the front is because these are all cards that, if they do draw a card, Orcish kills them with the 1 ping as well, which is pretty crazy. So if you are wanting to play a Strix and draw a card, you're probably going to lose it to an Orcish if it's either on the stack or in play. The Esper Sentinel a little bit different, but yeah, pretty brutal as kind of a kind of catch-all with Bowmasters. All right, so the Amass 1 Orcs, or Amass Orcs 1. This is the pressure part, and for me, the part that I think is quite unique for Maverick. We have seen builds with Bitter Blossom and some other effects that allow you to go wide, but traditionally Maverick is more of either a Protect the Queen, where you have something like a Massive Knight attacking in, and you have something like Mother of Runes protecting it, or you might have 2 or 3 creatures, but you never go too wide with Maverick. But with Orc, you obviously can if it's left untouched, which is really nice, and gives me vibes of kind of, you know, the Young Pyromancer or the Bitter Blossom effects within Legacy. So I do think it's quite strong, this part. But I would say it's not necessarily the reason why you would play it. It is kind of the cherry on top, because although it's great to go wide to potentially create some threats that your opponent has to deal with actual physical cards and create some sort of card advantage in that way, how many decks actually care about 1/1s in Legacy? And that's where it comes to deck building, because I think if you are playing Orc, you might want to look at ways to really make your opponent want to deal with those threats with cards like a Bolt or a Prismatic Ending. And I think you can do that in a few ways. You can have Stoneforge Mystic to equip them up and, you know, make your opponent deal with it with a Swords of Plowshares or a Lightning Bolt before they get in with a Jide or a sword of some kind. You have Grist as well, and, you know, trading away a token from a creature for an actual creature card of theirs is fantastic value. And then also going wide to steal things like the Monarch or the Initiative is another great way to kind of make your opponent have to respect these tokens, which I think is pretty key, because a lot of the time you might amass a bunch of tokens, but your opponent's just going to, you know, combo off and win, or not really care about them and do something else. So I think it is pretty interesting to look at it from a deck building perspective and see, hey, okay, we're going to be having access to these, you know, Orc tokens and going wide. How can we take advantage of that other than just being, you know, a 1/1 token? So what's the issue for Maverick? I would say that Orc, in regards to Maverick, the issue is that it's not that it can kill many of our creatures, but it's just that it's a very easy 2-for-1 for our opponent. So let's imagine we've just drawn a card with, you know, Sylvan Library. Actually, that's not a great one. Let's say we've drawn a bunch of lands. We've got Horizon Canopy in play. We have a Noble Hierarch in play, and we've gone to activate Canopy. They put in the Orcish Bowmaster. We draw a card. It triggers. You know, they've already pinged one of our Noble Hierarchs. They now ping, say, Thalia. You know, that's 2 cards already that they've dealt with. If we now use a Swords to Plowshares on it, or some other card that maybe we drew off the Canopy, it goes downhill very quickly. Even without drawing a card, even if it's just an Orc coming in and taking out an X1 creature of ours, and now for some reason it's a big enough of a threat to actually deal with it then and there and Swords to Plowshare it or something else, that's just, it's really tough. And I think decks like Bug Scam recently have shown how just 2-for-1ing a lot of things, you know, Uro, Sylvan Library, Baleful Strix, Grief, and Reanimate sort of shenanigans. It can be really hard for decks like Maverick with just kind of the 1-for-1 trades in Wasteland or Swords to keep up with that sort of value. And I think an Orc on the opposing side of the battlefield is going to lead to the same sort of friction where you're just not keeping up with these decks, which is really tough. That's where I think something like Punishing Fire could be a pretty nice way to move towards dealing with the Orc kind of metagame, where you're dealing with, you know, an Orc with a card that you can get back without too much deck building restriction. But we'll talk about that in a second. So, how do Mavericks beat the Orc? Obviously here, it is another Hate Bear-ish card that we can't snuff out. Dark Blast is a pretty interesting one, because with Dark Blast, you can of course replace your draw to get it back, it kills the Orc, and some other things happen. But I don't really think that is what Maverick's gonna move towards. I think, generally, Maverick's gonna be fine. From an answering perspective, I think we just do what we do best. Cards like Plague Engineer are going to be really strong. Zealous Persecution has seen, you know, time in the deck from time to time. And I do think if you do want to move away from the draw effects, I would still keep some of the instant speed ones, like Canopy, like Tireless Tracker, where although your opponent could just respond to you making the clue, you can of course just have the clues around and then draw from them when you deem it likely they either don't have access to Bowmaster or it just suits you a little bit better. So I do think there'll be some really cool deck building creativity over the next few weeks in how people actually either go about answering Bowmaster or playing it themselves. But in all honesty, we aren't really a deck that draws cards. We are a deck that has a lot of X1s, which is probably the biggest issue. But it could be a look around at maybe some different types of cards that aren't X1s that fit in the same category, which we'll get to in a little bit. So what about Bowmaster in the deck? Well, we've seen over time, cards like Tarmogoyf, obviously a great beater, not really keep its position in Maverick just because that's all it does. It's a pretty vanilla threat. And a lot of cards these days do provide both disruption and pressure, which is exactly what Orcish Bowmasters does, which is great for us. It's built in, it comes down and provides that value ASAP, which is great as an ETB, and it's a decent 2 CMC threat. For a long time now, Maverick's been getting some really good 3-drops in things like Grist, Endurance, obviously Ramanap, you have your Knights, so the 3 CMC slot is pretty high these days. What we don't really have is 2-drops. You have your Thalias, you have your Spirited Labyrinths. There has been a move towards Fiend Artisan in some builds as kind of a 2-mana slot. Even Scavenging Ooze and Gaddock Teeg have really been pushed out of the deck because of the power level of other cards, like Endurance, or like Deafening Silence. You know, just other cheaper ways to deal with combo decks or whatever you wanted to target with those creatures. So I think that Orcish Bowmasters adds something a little bit different. It also allows you to just hold up a flash creature, which is really nice against sorcery speed hate, like Prismatic Ending, or something bigger like Supreme Verdict. And I think also just gives you a little bit of built-in removal to a creature, which is great. A little bit like Morlock, in a way, that it is a creature, or at least a body that sticks around after you've hopefully dealt with an opposing creature. So Orcish Bowmasters is probably the perfect card to deal with an opposing Baleful Strix or Icewind Quaddle, because although they've drawn the card off the creature and obviously try to set up a 2-for-1, the Bowmaster is just a nice way to negate that value by dealing with the Strix or Icewing without having to actually really spend a card, and then your opponent most likely has to deal with the Bowmaster at some point, so you kind of come out okay there. So I think that we'll be seeing a lot of Bowmaster and Maverick over the coming weeks, probably as playsets for testing, just to see, you know, we want to see it as much as possible, but I would say it's probably going to become, if not a full playset, probably a 2 or 3 of. I think it's good enough to be at least a 2 of. I think 1 in the deck is just not enough, especially as a non-green threat. So where does it fit? Obviously in Abzan, I would say, or potentially a new build of some sort of 4-color build with, say, Punishing Fire, as I mentioned before. The Orcish takes the spot of kind of the traditional hate bear, so I would say we're going to be seeing a lot less Thalia or Spirited Labyrinth and more Orcish, which is quite nice in a few ways. It doesn't dilute the power of GreenSunsZenith. It does similar things to Spirit. Obviously, allowing them to draw and not allowing to draw are two whole different things, but just in that slot, they have similar roles, which is also nice because against a metagame where there's going to be a lot of these running around, replacing X1s with other X1s instead of just, including more X1 creatures in the deck alongside Spirits and Thalias is really nice. So I don't think we'll be seeing too many changes to the Green Suns targets or things like that. I think we'll be seeing changes to the white creatures in the deck that do the taxing effect of what Maverick wants to achieve. And then, yeah, obviously it's a great Fiend Artisan target. It's a great way to find it. And one thing that I like about Fiend Artisan is a little bit like Green Suns. If you Green Suns for 2, your opponent has to respond. So let's say you're up against 8 cast and you Green Suns for 2. Your opponent most likely thinks, okay, collect oof, let's float a bunch of mana, let's use our baubles, etc. If you Green Suns for 3, your opponent might think, oh, okay, maybe they're not playing Collect Oof and they're going for Night of Autumn, so let's just allow this to resolve. We can then respond to the Night of Autumn trigger. And that's a great point, or a great part to go, hey, let's actually just get Collect Oof here and kind of catch them out. I think you could do similar things with Orc, and I do like that just, Fiend Artisan for 2, once you get the Orc in play, that's it. Your opponent can't say, oh, okay, actually, I'm going to brainstorm in response to the Orc. No, it's in play. So I really like that as well, as just a kind of a hidden benefit of the card in Mav. Okay, for a second I thought I wrote where wrong, but where all good. What does Orc do to the format? So these are just some predictions for the coming weeks or months. Less tap out magic. So this is either players playing around Orc or holding it up. So you might have players who want to hold up a bolt with their Brainstorm or Ponder. You might have players just wanting to, hold up Orc instead of, tapping out for their own sorcery speed shenanigans. Probably more Plague Engineers as well. I think Plague Engineer is a very easy answer to Orc, and it's a very easy inclusion for decks already splashing black. It's another great card to splash on the board. You are going to be hitting some of the same cards that Orc does in regards to the X1 ability, but, decks like Elves or Cephalid Breakfast or some of the Painted decks running the Goblin setup is, still quite good for the Plague Engineer deck. So I think Plague is a pretty strong inclusion. Dark Blast is definitely interesting, and I would love to see some people playing it. Not against me. You guys can keep that away, but I think Dark Blast is a pretty nice way to deal with Orc and also get it back. And, if you don't want to have your creature killed when you draw a card, you can just dredge. So we're all good. Potentially some more creativity around X1 creatures. So things like people trying out Giver of Runes over Mother of Runes, or Gilded Goose over Mana Dorks, or maybe even moving to a Mox Diamond build where we see less Mana Dorks in some of these Maverick decks. I would say that in most of these situations, and I do say most, the downside of running a card like Giver or Gilded Goose over the upside of just the power of Mother Runes or Mana Dorks that get to tap for mana every single turn without any downside, or need to set up and get more food on the field, is worth it, and it's worth to run into Orc decks than to play cards like Giver and Gilded Goose that just haven't made it in the past in terms of power level in Maverick. I do think there will be a new Mono Black Initiative Stompy deck, and a lot of the thought around this is that Orc is just such a powerful 2-drop that I think that's kind of what the Initiative decks have been missing, outside of things like him or potentially turn 2 playing a 3-drop. I think that this could really spawn a new type of mono black stompy deck that isn't based around curses or based around kind of the Helm Leyline strategy. So that should be pretty interesting to monitor. One winner that I think would be great for this format is Mono White Dreadnought. And for those of you who are unaware of what Mono White Dreadnought is, this is a deck that is built around Phyrexian Dreadnought, which is a 12/12 for 1 mana. When it comes into play, you have to sacrifice, I believe, any number of creatures up into the power of 12. But if you play effects like Torpor Orb or Hushbringer, or Hushgriff, no, I got it wrong. But these are all effects like Torpor Orb, which don't cause creature ETBs to occur, pretty much. I think would be a great deck. I think, with Swords to Plowshares, and you have things like Solitude potentially. You have a Saga build, because Saga can, of course, also find... what are we talking about? Phyrexian Dreadnought. This deck has put up results before, and I think that in a time where people are, trying out Orc and trying different things, I think Mono White Dreadnought is a deck that's, great. It's got a really clear strategy of get a Dreadnought in and hit for 12 twice. Obviously, Torpor Orb effects against Orc is fantastic. You're not a deck that really draws cards either, so that's kind of my little take on what could be good here. And I just wanted to put in a moment of silence for Orcish Lumberjack, which was the original 1/1 Orc of Legacy. A great card in what people might refer to as Applejacks, which was pretty much a deck that used this as kind of a Lotus effect. You can do some pretty cool things with cards like Titania, but sadly just haven't really seen it pop up in a little while. But hey, thanks for listening. This is kind of just like my average take. I'm sure there's some much more equipped Legacy players out there with some pretty hot takes, but yeah, I hope you really enjoyed this kind of breakdown. And if you did, let me know in the comments if you do, because I actually don't mind putting this sort of content together. I actually really love it. And a big thank you to my Patreon and my patrons below for allowing me to do what I love, and that's put out content and keep building the GreenSunsZenith, streaming Maverick, streaming Depth, streaming fair creature-based content in Legacy. It's a real pleasure, and it's a great community bit to be a part of as well. So I very much appreciate you all, and let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think. Do you think some of my takes were off? Do you have a take of your own? I'd love to know. But until then, if you want to find me, you obviously are here on YouTube at Dukes on Twitch. You can also find me on Twitch at Dukes on Twitch and Twitter at Dukes on Twitch. All right, take care, play fair.